Hey, I'm Don Smith. Welcome to the Evangelize Me YouTube channel. Today we're going to be looking at Jesus' ministry when he was interacting with people while he was on earth, and we're going to discover that he asked lots of questions. And so I'm going to propose to you that maybe we should be asking questions too. So don't go anywhere. Well, hello everyone, and welcome back to the Evangelize Me YouTube channel. I'm Don Smith, and we're on episode 4 of our Sharing the Faith series. Just for a quick review, we started out by talking about the parable of the sower and how this sower goes out to sow the word of God, and he does so generously and liberally, scattering seed everywhere and, at every opportunity. And of course, that's an invitation to us to be able to also be able to spread the gospel everywhere we go and in every context, every conversation, every opportunity that we have, to be proclaiming this wonderful news that we have, that God is real and that he loves us and has redeemed us and forgiven us. And so we also laid down this foundational principle that Jesus is working in every single person's life to draw them to himself. And he's actively working. So that every person that I encounter, every person that I have a conversation with, God is already working in their lives. He's already, preparing the ground. He's already working. And so that I'm participating in something that God is already doing. And of course, we talked about how important it is to have a nutshell version of the gospel, a way of proclaiming the truth about us being these magnificent creations of God, that each and every single one of us was in the mind of God before he created anything at all. And that he knew that we would be affected by sin, that we would have to deal with shame and fear. And so, so he became one of us to bear our sin and our fear and our shame and even our death, so that he could proclaim that anyone who believes in him, though he die, yet shall he live. And he proclaimed that he was going to prepare a place for us. And so we look forward to an eternal life with Christ in the fullness of glory and joy and hope and peace, where there's no more sorrow. And that is, a nutshell version that we should be able to just, like when we need to say it, we can do it, right? And then last week we talked about, you shall be my witnesses. And we talked about testifying to the Lord and having this relationship with God, where even in relationships with our children and our spouses, our grandchildren, that we see all the time, maybe even every day, we always have a fresh testimony, simply because every day God's mercies are new to us. And he's always meeting us, always encouraging us, always revealing himself if we have eyes to see. And of course, even in those times when we go through these dry seasons, we still are, receiving comfort that we can share with others. I wanted to look a little more deeply at this before we move on to the next thing. I think this is an interesting scripture from Luke. It's about the man who had a multitude of demonic possession, demons possessing him. And it says, the man from whom the demons had gone out begged to go with him. But Jesus sent him away, saying, return home and tell how much God has done for you. And so the man went away and told all over town how much Jesus had done for him. Now this is an interesting story, because first of all, he goes and it says he begged to be able to go with Jesus. I mean, like his life was just complete shambles, and Jesus had returned him to sanity, and now he just wants to be with Jesus, right? And who doesn't want to be? And so, but Jesus' response, instead of saying, in a typically world situation, like leaders are always trying to gather followers, right? The more followers you have, the more influence you have, and the more power and all of that stuff. And Jesus, he's not into that at all. And so he says, what is the best thing for this person to do? And the best thing is to go home and tell how much God has done for you. And it's interesting that the man goes and talks all over town how much Jesus had done for him. What a beautiful image this is of witnessing. Now, of course, most of us haven't been delivered from legions of demons. Some of us have been Catholics our entire lives, and so it's always interesting when you hear a dramatic, conversion story of someone dealing with addictions or mental illness or a physical ailment that gets healed. I mean, and God does those things, and they're wonderful stories to hear. But for most of us, our story is not dramatic. But there's still an appreciation of grace that we need to have. For many Catholics, we were baptized when we were infants, right? We don't even remember being transferred out of the kingdom of darkness into the kingdom of light. But I know for me, I know that there is this, but for the grace of God, I don't know what I would be like, right? I know that I am totally dependent upon the grace of God for any sanity in my life, for any success in my life, for any stability, for any love, anything, all the good things, every good and perfect gift comes from above. All the good things that are in my life are gifts of grace to me, right? And who knows what I would have become apart from that grace. And so there's just an appreciation for grace that says, God didn't have to deliver me from lots of terrible sin, but that doesn't mean that I am not receiving as much grace as that person does. And so sometimes I think Catholics are sort of like, well, I don't have an exciting testimony. Yeah, you have a testimony of God's grace preserving you. You have a testimony of God's grace protecting you. In the same way that, like Mary, right? Mary was protected from original sin. And well, that's a tremendous gift in and of itself. It's not something that, like we can be proud of. Like, oh, well, I never did whatever. It's like, well, that was grace, right? And so you do have a testimony. And so the story of the woman in the well, we're all familiar with it, so I'm not going to read the whole story. Jesus is traveling with the disciples. They reach Samaria. Jewish people and Samaritans didn't associate with each other. They didn't like each other. They didn't interact with each other. The Jews, for the most part, despised the Samaritans, and the Samaritans despised the Jewish people, and so there was always this, this conflict. And so they're traveling through Samaria, and they reach this town, and Jesus sits down at a well and sends the disciples off, and it's noontime, so it's the heat of the day. And this woman comes out to get her water. Now, she's probably coming out like most people I would think would come out in the early morning or in the evening when it's cool. But then so she's probably coming out there just because she doesn't want to be around other people. Who knows, right? So she gets there, and Jesus starts with a question, which we're going to look at that in a little while. But he says, "Will you get me a drink?" And she says, why are you even talking to me? I'm a Samaritan, and I'm a woman. So there's, I have 2 strikes against me as far as you, a Jewish man, is concerned. And Jesus, of course, says, if you knew who was talking to you, you'd ask him, and he'd give you water. And she's like, well, where are you going to get water? And he's like, oh, I have living water, and you'd never thirst again. And then, of course, he tells her, go get your husband. And she says, I don't have a husband. And he says, yeah, you're right. You've had 4 or 5 men or husbands. And so they end up in this religious conversation about where, the Samaritans worship in one place and the Jews in the other. And at the end of this interchange is very, very interesting. The woman said, I know that the Messiah is coming. And when he comes, he'll explain everything to us. I, the one speaking to you, I am he, Jesus says. Then, leaving her water jar, the woman went back to the town and said to the people, come see the man who told me everything I ever did. Could this be the Messiah? So notice that she leaves her water jar. Of course, in her encounter with Christ, she has received the living water that he was talking about, right? So she doesn't, like, John includes these little details just to say, like, she left the reason why she came out there because she got what she needed, right? She goes back to town and starts spreading the story, right? And so it says, they came out of town and made their way towards him. Many of the Samaritans from that town believed in him because of the woman's testimony. He told me everything I ever did. So when the Samaritans came to him, they urged him to stay with him, and he stayed for 2 days. And because of his words, many more became believers. So I just want to highlight something here. She has an encounter with Christ, and she testifies to everyone she can about it. And because, I mean, like, look at the wording here, because of the woman's testimony, many people believed. I want to propose to you that you have a testimony, and that, people might come, in fact, I would dare say, would come to Christ because of your testimony, if you are willing to share it. This, I think, is a really powerful story. And then, of course, when they hear Jesus himself, they invite him to stay for 2 days, which is really funny because, like, he's a Jewish person, right? And I'm like usually Samaritans would be like, get out of here. You're on your way to Jerusalem. We don't want to have anything to do with you. And they say, stay. And he stays for 2 days. What happened during those 2 days? Tell us more, John. Like, I want to hear the whole story, of the meals that were shared. Did they have campfire at night? What happened? But he tells us what we need to know. And then they said to the woman, we no longer believe just because of what you said. Now we have heard for ourselves, and we know that this man really is the Savior of the world. What a statement of faith, right? I mean, Jesus hasn't died yet. He hasn't risen from the dead. Now, I mean, like, when you see Jesus risen from the dead in his glory, and you see the scars on his hand, then you can say, wow, he really is the Savior of the world. But here, just by hanging out with Jesus for 2 days, they're convinced that he is who he said he was. So we're talking about these encounters with people and conversations with people. So I propose to you that one of the first tools is this idea of sharing our own relationship with God, right? Saying, like, this is how God is real to me. This is how God comforts me. This is how God meets me. This is how he encourages me. Because that is really, like, it's not threatening. It's not preachy. It's just being vulnerable and real and authentic. One of the things that you notice with Jesus' ministry is that he asks a lot of questions. In fact, over 300 times in the Gospels, Jesus asks questions. So here's just 5 out of the over 300. Who do you say that I am? Right? Kind of a probing question, trying to find out. Now, Jesus knows, let's just back up. Jesus knows everything. He is God in the flesh. I mean, there's several times, many times in the scripture where he says, like, perceiving their thoughts, he said, right? So he knows what's going on around him. He knows what's going on with these people. He knows the answers to these questions. So why is he asking questions? He's not asking for his own benefit. He's asking for the people's benefit, right? And so he turns to the disciples and he says, who do you say that I am? He wants them to explore and express where they are at in their faith journey for their benefit, right? So that they can understand, right? So that they can have a moment of faith where they make a decision, right? And articulate it. And Peter, of course, makes that, like, you're the Son of the living God. And, he says, the Holy Spirit is the one who revealed this to you. It's a dramatic moment that begins with a simple question. What do you want me to do for you? Jesus asks. Now, if someone is paralyzed, like there's a story of the paralytic laying next to the pool, and he says, "Do you want to be healed?" Well, Jesus knows, but he's asking because he wants that person to actually reflect. Like, okay, you make your living by begging, and if you're not paralyzed anymore, you're not going to be able to beg anymore. Like your whole identity, your whole understanding of your life and your personhood is shaped and formed around your sickness. And so Jesus says, "Hey, listen, do you want to be healed?" Right? I mean, like it's a challenge. It's what do you want me to do for you? Why do you call me Lord, Lord, and do not do what I say? That's an interesting one, don't you think? Do you love me? Remember, he says this to Peter after he's risen from the dead, and he says it 3 times for the 3 times that Jesus or that Peter denied him. And then he says to the woman outside the tomb when she discovers the empty tomb, he says, "Why are you weeping?" So when you go through this Gospels, you'll notice Jesus uses questions all the time. Sometimes he answers questions with questions. Sometimes he answers questions with stories. Like, the person comes along and says, I know I'm supposed to love my neighbor, but who's my neighbor? And Jesus could have just said, well, like, everybody's your neighbor, right? But instead, he tells the story of the Good Samaritan, which, again, you got that Samaritan thing, right? You have the Jewish people who walk by the injured person, but you have the Samaritan, the person that like Jews would be like, ugh, like not a Samaritan, right? The Samaritan is the one who stops and helps. And then Jesus asks, so who's the neighbor, right? Who is the one who loved his neighbor? So so he doesn't just answer the question, but that he tells the story, and then he asks the question, now which one was it? And the people have to admit, it was the Samaritan, right? Because they have to come to that conclusion. And so Jesus uses questions in very unique ways. One of these stories that I think is interesting is when an official comes and asks, "Good teacher, what must I do to inherit eternal life?" And so, that would be like someone coming up to us and saying, like, how do I get to heaven, right? And then we'd have an opportunity, because we have our little, gospel in a nutshell, to tell them the gospel and invite them to faith, right? Let's sign you up for the RCA class, like, oh my gosh, this is ripe fruit. This is so exciting. But the interesting thing is that Jesus doesn't answer his question, at least not right away. Jesus answered him and said, "Why do you call me good? No one is good but God alone." Now, this is a weird response, right? Jesus doesn't even begin to address the question of eternal life, seemingly, but he instead picks up on the little phrase, "good teacher," and he says, "Why do you call me good? No one is good but God alone." Now, Jesus is God, so he is good, but he's making a point. And that point becomes more obvious as the conversation goes on when Jesus says, "Keep the commandments." And this official says, "Oh, I've kept all of the commandments from my youth." Now, you got to stop and understand the Jewish understanding of this, of keeping the commandments, right? Because it wasn't just the 10 commandments. It was all of the rules and regulations, hundreds of them, that defined what those 10 commandments meant. And so, like just working on the Sabbath. So it'd be like, okay, you can untie your horse, but you can't feed your horse, right? You can do this, but you can't do that. And so you had this, very detailed regulations to follow. It's kind of like the examination of conscience that you might read before you go to confession. And so under the, do not murder. Well, underneath that, it would be easy to be like, well, I never murdered. But when you start going through the examination, it's like, did you gossip? Did you slander somebody? Did you, ruin somebody's reputation through lying? I mean, like, it's just like this. It's like, oh, yeah, I've done all those, right? I definitely broke that commandment. Isn't that amazing? See, and this is what Jesus is saying. And so he's like, he's drawing this person out for them to say, I've kept all the commandments I am good. And so rather than answer the question that the person asked, he asks him a question, right? Good teacher, what can I do to have eternal life? And Jesus turns it all around and says, why do you call me good? Right? Right? No one is good. All human beings are affected by sin. Of course, Jesus isn't affected by sin. But certainly that official was. So Jesus, see how he cuts right to the heart of the matter with these questions. And so a couple of things before you ask, before you take this tool. This is another tool that I'm putting in your toolbox. But before you use this tool, I want you to think about something. Before you ask a question, you have to be ready to listen, right? And listening is a skill. It's an activity. It's not something that we do passively. Lots of times I don't think we're very good listeners. Lots of times I think that we, as the person's talking, we're formulating our arguments, we're forming, our rebuttal. And the whole point of this exchange, this asking a question, is to be able to learn about the person. To be able to learn where they're at and what's going on in their lives and what they believe, all of those things that we'll look at in a couple minutes. And the only way that you're going to learn is by actively listening, seeking to understand. So Steve Covey wrote a book, 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, that was a very powerful tool in my life when I read it years and years and years and years ago. I've read it many times since then, and I used the principles that he espouses in that book. And one of them is that principle of seek first to understand before you seek to be understood. And the idea, of course, is, in a business setting, in a sales setting, you would want to understand your customers' desires and needs and all of that stuff before you launch into a sales pitch. Because the idea, of course, is that you're building relationship, you're building trust, you're seeking to understand where this person's coming from. And so it's the same when we're having these personal conversations, that before I start proclaiming to you the gospel, I want to understand you better. I want to understand your journey better. And so we want to listen. The other thing is that if you don't want to know the answer, then don't ask the question, right? And the reason why I say this is that some of us have had very difficult family lives, right? We have very difficult relationships with our children or our grandchildren. We've had, difficult marriages or divorces, or, maybe we were dealing with our own sin, or we're dealing with our own addictions. And so when we have conversations with our children, sometimes we might not want to know, right? Like, why don't you believe in God? And be like, well, it's because you're such a jerk, Dad, right? It's like, you went to church every Sunday, but then you did all of these things, right? And so there is a possibility for healing here, right? If we can acknowledge our own fault, right? If we can acknowledge, you're absolutely right. Like I was a terrible witness. Like I don't blame you for not following God, because I was a terrible example of what a Christian looked like. And it's okay. It's okay to be honest, right? But again, especially in family relationships, it's important that you're prepared for answers that might be difficult. And then if there's answers that you really am afraid of or not ready to hear, then don't ask. Okay, that's pretty simple. So you got to listen and then be ready for whatever the answer is. So this is one of the ones that I really like. This is a question that I've used on many occasions, and I've used it in different situations, in different circumstances. And it's a very simple: have you ever had a time in your life where you experienced the presence of God? Now, this is building on that premise that God is working in every single person's life, right? And so when you ask this question, you're assuming God has done something in every person's life to reveal himself. They might not be aware of it, right? And so I've asked this to people who, who would say, I don't believe in God. And then just say, well, have you ever had a time when you felt like there was a God, right? Have you ever had an experience where you knew that God was real or that God loved you? And it's fascinating because I had people like all of a sudden be like, well, yeah, geez, I had this head-on collision and totaled both vehicles and all this terrible stuff, and I walked away without a scratch, and the state trooper told me it was a miracle, right? And it's like, well, that might have been God, right, in your life. I can remember doing a baptism prep. I'd meet with couples individually, and then we'd have a class. And in the individual conversation, it was this young couple, and they had faith, but they weren't really practicing. And so one of the things that we do is I go through the rite and say, geez, you're about to make a promise that you're going to raise this child in the practice of the faith. What does that mean? Blah, blah, blah. And so we get into the class, and I start the class by asking this question. And this woman, all of a sudden, she's just like, oh, yeah. She said, I had a really powerful experience with the Lord once. And then she starts crying. And she says, like, when I was in youth ministry, we had this youth event, and we were doing adoration, and the priest picked up the monstrance and walked down the aisle, and he stopped right in front of me, and I knew that Jesus was standing in front of me, and then he blessed me. Jesus blessed me. And obviously it was an incredibly powerful event. And the interesting thing was, like, her husband looked at her like, I've never heard this story before in my life, right? And yet it was this incredibly powerful thing. I remember a time in my life where my brother was kind of in this pro-choice mode, and so he kept bringing it up in conversations, and it was like Thanksgiving time, and it always led to this difficult thing of like trying to prove that like, oh, pro-life is the most logical and makes the most sense scientifically and all of these things, and they never ended well, and they didn't end. It wasn't helping our relationship. And so I can remember a Thanksgiving where I turned to my brother and I asked him this question: have you ever had a time in your life where you knew that God was real? And he described this beautiful Christmas Eve service with the candles and the music, and he said, I felt the presence of the Holy Spirit, or the Holy Spirit touched me, or something like. And I was just like, what? Like the Holy, you're talking about the Holy Spirit? Like you who haven't gone to church in years? Like, this is amazing. This is like, it was, and the interesting thing about inviting someone to share these stories is that it kind of shifts the relationship a little, right? It shifts it to be like, wow, like we have something in common. I'm like, like I can be vulnerable with you in this context. And so it changes, it can change the relationship, to some degree. So that's a really good question, right? Have you ever had a time in your life where you've experienced the presence of God or the love of God or the protection of God? What do you believe? And why do you believe that? And again, you're asking sincerely. You really want to know, right? Because you have people who are, they're in New Age. They like take an amalgamation of all the different religions and faiths, and so they like they believe in reincarnation, but then they don't believe in something else, and they don't like organized religion, and so it's like, and really, the question is, like, I want you to reflect on what you believe, right? I want you to be able to articulate your spirituality and your spiritual beliefs, right? And so, what do you believe, and why do you believe that? As a follow-up question, because and so it's sort of like it kind of challenges them to be like, well, I don't know. It's like I believe it because I kind of just put it all together myself, right? Or I believe it because I've had. I had this really good friend who convinced me that it's right, or, like that's how I grew up, or, like whatever it is, because what you're doing is discovering this person. You're discovering where this person is on this faith journey that we talked about, right? This scale of belief. And lots of times it's very interesting that you might discover that a person has areas of faith that you share in common. I can remember being at a campfire with a young man and asking him, what he believed, because he had said some things, and I said, "So tell me what exactly do you believe?" And so and so he talked about he knows that there are spiritual beings, and there are good spiritual beings and bad spiritual beings, and that they're right here, like we live in a spiritual world. And I said, "Yeah, you're right. Like we would call those angels and demons, and you're right. They're right here with us, right?" And so then he said, "Well, people who have died are here too." And I said, "Oh, you're right. We call that the communion of saints, right?" And so we had this awesome conversation, and on the surface of it, if I had just started talking about Jesus, he would have been like I don't want to hear. But because I engaged him, and it was someone who I still see on a regular basis, and it changed our relationship. Like, we have a different relationship now than we had before that campfire, right? Because I listen to him, and he knows that I care about him, and we have some common ground, right? And he knows that, there's lots of things that aren't common, but we have a connection now. Okay? Tell me about your spiritual journey, right? Because every single person has this little journey. And again, what you're doing is reminding people, hey, you're not just a physical being. You're not just an emotional being. You are a spiritual being. And so, tell me about that aspect of your personality. Tell me about that aspect of your life. How did you arrive at these conclusions? Tell me your story, right? Every single human being is an eternal being, right? Created in the image of God. Every single one of us has hopes and dreams and tragedies and pain and loneliness. And so we have this desire to be known, right? To be known and to be loved, which of course only gets ultimately met in our relationship with God. But you and I, as agents of Christ, have an opportunity to hear people's stories, to affirm their pain, to bring them comfort, to encourage them, to pursue the spiritual journey, and maybe, help with that process. We all know people who don't go to church anymore, right? We all know Catholics who don't go to church. And so one of the questions that I hardly ever hear anyone ask, unless it's, usually it's not even that. Usually when parents are talking to children, it's you need to go to church, right? But asking someone, why don't you go to church anymore? And of course, you're going to get some different answers. I mean, like very often people don't go to church because of, they perceive that it's full of hypocrites. Sometimes they don't go to church because they've been hurt in a church. I can remember a woman saying, the priest treated her so horribly at her mother's funeral that she would never go back to the Catholic Church. And there's a place there where we can be an agent of healing and saying, you're absolutely right. He never should have treated you that way, right? And then remind people, if the opportunity presents itself, of the sacraments. And we'll talk more about that next week when we talk about answers. Sometimes people haven't really made a decision not to go to church, and they feel guilty about it. It's just like their life get busy. They had kids. They keep meaning to go back. They're planning on going back someday, right? And so just asking this question, it's sort of like reminding them of the desire, reminding them that like I didn't really ever make a decision not to go back to church. It just never happened, right? And of course, this is where, maybe sometimes these questions get turned around, right? Sometimes people say, like, well, why do you go to church, right? And so I can say, like, or I don't go to church because I just ran out of time. It's like, well, man, for me, that 1 hour, just 1 hour a week dedicated to God, kind of recenters me, helps me with my priorities, helps me to remember what my life is all about. See, and so it's just like this opportunity. It's just like, just throw it out there. This is what I get out of going to church, right? And of course, when people, might have that conversation of asking you the question in return, and then of course you have an opportunity to witness. If you talk to someone and they're going to a church, it's always interesting. I think it's interesting. It's like, why did you choose that church? Why do you go to that church? And sometimes it's like, well, it's the closest one, or sometimes it's one my family members go to, or I really like the pastor, or the music's really good. And asking, it's like, well, what do you get out of that, right? And again, you're asking these questions to learn and to understand and to build relationship and to build trust. And so, remember, this idea that what we're doing is participating. We're representing Christ in these conversations, right? And in asking these questions, not only are we gaining knowledge, but we're inviting them to reflect about, like, what do you get out of going to church? And then finally, there's what do you think or believe about Jesus? And so lots of times when I ask somebody, like, what do you believe? And they'll say, like, I believe in, I had a young woman once who said, when I pray, I sit down on the ground and I put my hands on the ground and I feel the earth's energy, right? And so it's like, okay, that's a different way of praying. And, there is, spiritual energies in this world, and so then sometimes I follow up with this question: well, what do you think or believe about Jesus? And it's interesting that how few people really have any clue about Jesus, right? Their impression is like, well, he was a good teacher and he told people to love. He was, he's just another religious leader, just like Muhammad and Buddha and all the others who had a message for humans to become better human beings, which of course is not true at all. Well, I mean, he did have a message about becoming better human beings, but he's not like the other religious leaders. And so again, you have this opportunity. Sometimes it's interesting just to say, well, have you ever read about Jesus' life? Have you ever read what he taught? Right? I mean, like, when people say, well, he was a good teacher. He taught people. It's like, have you ever read it? I mean, like, the Gospel of Mark only takes, an hour and a half to read. It's the shortest gospel. A challenge you. Go read the Gospel of Mark. And let's have this conversation again, about what you thought about it. Since you're formulating these beliefs, but you don't even know why you're formulating these beliefs. So, and then of course you have, people will be like, I read the entire Bible 10 times and it's full of contradictions. And so, it's always interesting. And so, of course, part of this process is going to be having answers to some of these issues that come up. And having responses, not, hopefully feeling confident enough to be able to respond in ways that are appropriate and not overly emotional or over reactions, defensive, all of those things. So when you ask these questions, I think that we provide an opportunity for people to explore where they're really at, and maybe to be able to see how God is working in their lives. And it certainly provides an opportunity for us to be in relationship with people. And so I encourage you to think about questions that you would be comfortable with, and you might have your own, right? I mean, these are just suggestions. I have my favorites that I go to, but there's a zillion questions that you could ask to get people engaged in their spirituality and in their faith journey. And so look for those opportunities. Next week, we're going to be looking at the answers to some of these issues and questions, right? Like, how do you handle some of these conversations and do it gracefully? And so I hope you'll join me then. Thanks for being with me. And I pray that God blesses you with lots of fruitful conversations in this coming week.